The spinal cord is the major neural pathway between the sensory impulses to the brain and the motor impulses from the brain. It can also integrate information on its own and control spinal reflexes and automatic motor responses. The cord diameter decreases as it gets farther from the brain, except for the cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement. That's where numerous nerves are going to supply the upper and the lower limbs. A narrow passage inside the spinal cord containing cerebral spinal fluid is called the central canal. The surface of the spinal cord is indented by the posterior median sulcus and a deeper anterior median fissure. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they are identified by a letter and number relating to the nearby vertebrae. Each has a pair of dorsal root ganglia containing the cell bodies of sensory neurons with axons in the dorsal root. Ventral roots contain motor neuron axons. Roots are contained in a spinal nerve. Notice how the cord diameter is largest at the cervical region and decreases as it gets closer to the sacrum, with the only exceptions being the cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement, like I mentioned previously. On this cross-section of the spinal cord, notice the central canal, that little circle, and the posterior median sulcus, so that would be the side that's facing the back, and the anterior median fissure, and that would be the side that is facing the stomach, if you will. And the spinal nerves, again, you can see them listed here, very similar to their nearby vertebra numbers. And also notice the dorsal root and the ventral root in that cross-section of the spinal cord. Again, remember that the dorsal roots are going to contain the cell bodies of sensory neurons, and the ventral roots contain the motor neuron axons. So if you had to draw arrows of which way the information is traveling here, the dorsal root ganglia would have information coming from the nerve towards the spinal cord. And if you were to draw an arrow for the ventral root, that would be information leaving the spinal cord going towards the ventral root. Just a little application for you there. This is a similar figure of that cross-section, but much more detailed. You can see how it shows the important anatomical landmarks of the spinal cord. The central gray matter is made up of glial cells and nerve cell bodies. The projections of the gray matter into the white matter are called horns, or they kind of look like butterfly wings to me, so the tips of the butterfly wings. The location of the cell bodies in the specific nuclei of the gray matter relate to their function. So the posterior gray horns are somatic and visceral sensory nuclei, and the lateral gray horns are visceral, so autonomic nervous system, motor nuclei. The anterior gray horns are somatic motor nuclei. White matter is myelinated and unmyelinated axons, and it can be organized into three columns: the posterior column, the lateral column, and the anterior column. And these columns contain either ascending tracts to the brain or descending tracts from the brain to the peripheral nervous system. So take a moment, damage to which root of a spinal nerve would interfere with motor function? Look back and see if you can answer that question. Pause the recording. The next section in your textbook starts to do a tour de brain, and it lists 6 major regions of the brain in this section 8-7. The first major region is the cerebrum, and this is where you're going to have conscious thought processes. The next major region is the diencephalon, and the thalamic portion contains relay and processing centers for sensory information. The hypothalamic portion contains centers involved with emotions, autonomic function, and hormone production. Again, that's the diencephalon. Number 3, the midbrain processes visual and auditory information, and it generates involuntary motor responses. The pons, number 4, contains tracts and relay centers that connect the brainstem to the cerebellum. Number 5, the medulla oblongata contains major centers concerned with the regulation of autonomic function like heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, and digestive activities. And last but not least, the cerebellum, number 6, adjusts voluntary and involuntary motor activities. So here we have a figure that highlights some of the major regions of the brain from a superior view. The cerebrum is divided into paired cerebral hemispheres, meaning there's a right hemisphere and there's a left cerebral hemisphere. And these are separated by the long groove right in the middle called the longitudinal fissure. Each hemisphere sends and receives information from the opposite side of the body. The surface of the cerebrum is pictured here in a lateral view. You can see that there's folds that are called gyri, and these are separated by deep depressions called sulci. There is a very deep central sulcus right in the middle that extends laterally from the longitudinal fissure. There's also a number of important lobes labeled here. The lobes are named for the cranial bones above the lobe, so each lobe has different sensory regions and motor regions, and we'll point those out later in this lecture. First, the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is anterior to the central sulcus and is bordered inferiorly by the lateral sulcus. And note the precentral gyrus that's labeled here. The temporal lobe is just inferior to the lateral sulcus. The parietal lobe extends between the central sulcus and the parieto-occipital sulcus, which is better seen on the next figure that I'm going to show you. Note that the post-central gyrus is also labeled in this figure. Last, the occipital lobe is located most posteriorly on the cerebrum. If we look inside, deep to the cerebrum is the diencephalon, which is divided into the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. The brainstem is also labeled in this figure. The brainstem contains the midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. The cerebellum is the most inferior and posterior portion of the brain. Regions of this cortex are linked together by a deeper white matter. Note the corpus callosum links the left and the right hemispheres and is labeled here. It looks like a large upside-down sea of white matter. This figure is showing the ventricles of the brain, and these ventricles are spaces that are filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and they're lined with the ependymal cells. The two lateral ventricles within each cerebral hemisphere drain through the interventricular foramen into the third ventricle, and then into the diencephalon, which drains through the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle, which then drains into the central canal of the spinal cord. So cerebral spinal fluid surrounds and bathes the exposed surfaces of the central nervous system, and it circulates around the roots that are indicated by the red arrows in this figure. Cerebrospinal fluid is important to kind of float the brain. It's used to transport nutrients, chemicals, and wastes for the brain. And it's produced by the choroid plexus, And this is continually secreted and replaced about 3 times per day. Circulation from the fourth ventricle into the subarachnoid space then circulates into the dural sinuses. This figure is showing the surface of the cerebral hemisphere and some of the important cortexes which are located on the cerebrum. So the precentral gyrus, the one that I pointed out to you on the earlier figure, it's noted here as a dark red. It's part of the frontal lobe, and this precentral gyrus contains the primary motor cortex. The gustatory, auditory, and olfactory cortexes are in the temporal lobe, and you can see those pictured in kind of a yellowy orange and pink and purple, where the two graspers are pulling the temporal lobe down. The visual cortex, pictured in green, is in the occipital lobe. The association areas are also shown in this figure, and they interpret incoming information and coordinate motor responses, integrating the sensory and motor cortexes. The somatic sensory association of the parietal lobe helps to recognize touch, and that's pictured in blue. The somatic motor association area of the frontal lobe is responsible for coordinating movement. That's pictured in kind of a pink in this figure. This figure is showing hemispheric lateralization, and that's a concept that different brain functions can and do occur on one side of the brain and maybe not necessarily the other. The left hemisphere tends to be involved in language skills, analytical tasks, and logic, with the general interpretive area pictured in a darker purple on the left again, which integrates sensory information to form visual and auditory memory. And the speech center, which is pictured in orange, which regulates breathing and vocalization, the motor skills needed for speaking. The right hemisphere tends to be involved in analyzing sensory input and relating it to the body, specifically spatial visualization and analysis, as well as analyzing emotional content. The prefrontal cortex in the frontal lobe of both hemispheres coordinates information from the entire cortex, and it provides us with skills such as predicting timelines, making judgments, even feelings such as frustration, tension, and anxiety. So how do we know all of this? Well, the electrical activity of the brain can be monitored and measured by placing electrodes on the brain or outer surfaces of the skull, and changes are noted depending on the stimulus. The changes in the electrical patterns are called brain waves, and they can be visualized with an EEG. Now, this is a printed record of brainwave activity, and it can be used to diagnose brain disorders and pick up on differences in brain activity. We do have a number of more modern techniques, however, and more are always coming out, but some include brain imaging using the PET scan and MRIs, and this has allowed for a very extensive mapping of the brain's functional areas. The picture that I have here is an EEG with the different brain waves. For example, alpha waves are synchronized when a person is resting. That second category there, beta waves, are typically synchronized with intense concentration. Theta waves are synced under stress or frustration, and then delta waves are typically synced when you're sleeping. And you'll learn more about that in Advanced Anatomy and Physiology Lab, as we actually perform and generate EEGs. So accessing stored information gathered through previous experiences is memory, and there are many different kinds of memory. There's fact memory, where you just simply recall bits of information. Skilled memory is a little bit different. This is learned motor skills that can be incorporated into unconscious memory. One of those classic examples is riding a bike. It's something that you don't have to think about. Your muscles just seem to remember how to do it. That's skilled memory. Short-term memory doesn't last very long unless you reinforce it with repetition, and then you can convert that short-term memory into long-term memory through a process called memory consolidation. And then long-term memory is that memory that remains for long periods of time. Sometimes they can last an entire lifetime. Typically, we don't refer to amnesia unless you have memory loss that's a result of disease or trauma.